Can't tell if it's on. Is it on?
It's on.
It's on, so
Testing.
that's on. That's definitely on, that one. So is this on? This is on, right?
It's on, yeah.
Is that loud enough? Can you hear me back there? It's going out? So what's your name? Say? Minoff. Mioff. Yeah. So do you do Scrum or Kanban or anything like that? Say? Flow? Slovakia. No, I'm saying if you, like as a developer, do you do Scrum or Kanban? Scrum. Scrum? 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 Is anybody doing Kanban? Some Kanban? Are you doing Kanban? He's on my team, so it's going out. Say? We are doing Scrum, and I'm like kind of like I'm going to be I'm really an advocate of Kanban for really practical reasons, not really for philosophical reasons. Scrum works, but you really have to like pay attention to, like, you have to go and read what Scrum really actually is and do it, or else you kind of get jammed up a lot, I think. And we're going to talk about some of this stuff. It has to do with, one of the things I have like trouble with Scrum, it's not a problem with Scrum, it's how people do it. It has to do with the amount of time you spend talking about stuff at the end of the sprint, right? Figuring out, like, you know, is this done, or is it going to what are we going to, the tasks we're going to carry over to the next sprint? Is you know, there's a lot of time that you spend talking about that stuff that you kind of in Kanban you don't have to, because your sprints are elastic in Kanban, right? You should still be doing like sort of sprinting on stuff, so you're not doing like 6 months of work, right, without checkpoints, right? You're going to do smaller blocks of work. But if like in Scrum, it's going to be like Thursday at noon GMT that your sprint is done, right? And if it's your work's, you know, if you have 17 minutes more work that, you know, usually if you have a couple of tasks that are not done, then the whole thing should get rolled over into another sprint, right? But then if you have release management, that it's like, this is like we really need it in this release, and these two tasks, and it's cost of it. And so we're going to talk about that, like that, not specifically in the way I'm referring to it in Scrum, but that dynamic of how important that dynamic of where your time is going is really a big part of it. So that's all precursor. We still have a few minutes that, you know, talk about. So is there something that's important to you in terms of process that you're thinking about? What's that?
What you're proposed to say is exactly what I wanted.
Yeah, that part right there. That's a really big part of it, right? I'm just trying to get you some sense of like what's important to you in going out. The other one that we like, that put emphasis on here, and the things that I talk about in emphasis are just because of the things that I can see as being problems. And one is like stakeholder expectations, right? Is obviously who doesn't have problems like setting and meeting stakeholder expectations, right? It's a really hard thing to do, right? Because you end up like making these commitments, right? They're not commitments when you make them, right? They're just like your like hopeful suggestions on when things are going to be done, right? And then later on, right, they're like you're in the middle of things, and then those suggestions became commitments, and then that ends up screwing things up because you end up having to spend more time like doing things that are related to these expectations rather than just getting work done. And I'm not suggesting that there's any kind of easy answer to that problem, but since it's one of the biggest problems, then it's one that we should try to, like in terms of our practices, try to figure out what kind of practices we need in order to you know, make that a smaller problem than it is. All right, that's one. It's going out. So I'm kind of doing a survey on what kind of, like, if people are doing Scrum or Kanban or something other than Scrum and Kanban.
Yeah, I'm a Scrum Master.
You're a Scrum Master.
Yeah.
It's going out, yeah. And Nothing, right? It's okay, right? Nothing is okay, right? It's not like everything in the world is Scrum or Kanban, right? You can still just like get work done without those things, right? So going out. So what do you like about Scrum?
I like that the customer is like part of the team in our case.
Yes.
So yeah, I like it that he has like is there every step of the way till the website is live.
So have you ever run Scrum where the customer is like absent, missing in action?
Yeah.
Right. That's terrible, isn't it?
It's terrible, and one colleague is like PO then, and it's different because you don't get the feedback right away.
Right. It's bad no matter what system you're using. It's bad if you don't have access to the product owner. But in Scrum, it's just like it's like death, right? You're there, like you got like all this work you've committed to. You've got unanswered questions that come up in the context of doing the work, and the clock is ticking, and the time box is coming up, and you don't have answers.
And it's kind
So
of
we're going to have a bit of a buffer to
method where you get your feedback at the end of the project.
absolutely.
When
No,
the
definitely.
customer sees
And then I'll
website.
hand that microphone.
They should see that at the end of each sprint. You mean in sprint review, right? They should come into it, yeah. One really cool difference in Scrum is that over Waterfall is that, in Scrum there's this thing invest. Are you familiar with that? INVEST is independent, negotiable, estimable, small, valuable, testable. Did I cover them all? Right? All those things, right? So that's invest, that's Scrum. And negotiable is the part where that says that when the story goes in, you've got a business objective, but you haven't actually made a firm commitment on how it's going to be implemented. And so it goes in, that way you can meet your sprint goal. You can say, we'll get this business objective done, but we don't know exactly how. It's negotiable how it's going to be done. Whereas Waterfall would say, you've resolved, it's not negotiable, right? You've got something that's fixed. And so sometimes I've done Scrum where actually nothing's negotiable, right? We have to have everything done exactly down to the CSS class specified in a comp. And it's like if it's not exactly everything down to the pixel detail, and Scrum's a bad fit for that kind of thing. So we're ready to, okay, so.
Yeah, it's 4 p.m.
All right.
We're going to start with our session. We're going to start with our session on avoiding the best practices trap. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to contributing to the Drupal project tomorrow, 9 a.m., First Timers Workshop, mentored contribution, general contribution.
This is a shout out to Acquia, who's the sponsor for the agency track. Thank you very much, Acquia. We work with them in our company every day. They host all of our websites.
So my name is Marin Balabanov. I'm a content designer at Appnovation, mainly in digital marketing.
And I'm Michael Godak. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. And I'm a business analyst, decision analyst, whatever that means.
So our session is split up into 3 parts. This is the structure of our talk. And we're going to have a discussion after this. A couple of intriguing names there, particularly the last one sounds a bit brutal, but it should give your agency a better shot at survival in the face of the kind of pressures we face trying to build and deliver software today.
That an adult is a child who survived is a quote from Ursula Le Guin, if you remember. Anybody read
Yeah,
Ursula
science
Le Guin?
fiction writer. Yeah.
Right?
She just passed away a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, she's an awesome writer. But yeah, we want your agency to grow up and survive, right? So you need to get the practices that are going to let you grow up.
Yeah, Act 1, thinking from first principles. So Michael, what is a best practice and why can we fall into a trap with that?
Like a bear trapper,
Yeah.
right? So this is from Wikipedia, this definition, right? So a best practice is a method or technique that's been generally accepted as better than any alternative because it produces results that are superior to those achieved by other means, or because it has become the standard way of doing things.
So one way I understand it is that best practices as a trap is because you just adopt it because it's supposed to be best, and it becomes a standard way of doing things without considering whether it solves your specific problems. That's where we can fall into the actual trap. And when I think of best practice, and when I look that up on the internet, you usually get a checklist. It's like, SEO best practices, 1, 2, 3, check that off, you got it. Or digital marketing best practices. But this is not what we're talking about, or is it?
We're intending something more here, right? When we talk about best practices, agile best practices, we're thinking things like continuous integration, automated testing, code design and reviews, those kind of things that are really closer to this idea of a standard or superior approach to overcoming the real challenges that your development team faces. And so a software development team, your process is a collection of practices that you've curated, and if you do Scrum, you kind of comes with a package of practices. And these practices are the components of this process. And if you know Joel Splotsky's law of leaky abstractions, the process as that all abstractions are leaky. So if the process is an abstraction of your actual work stream, your abstraction is leaky too.
Yeah, because the abstraction itself is so far removed from the day-to-day reality, it is an insufficient. It is per se leaky or insufficient.
Yeah, so we want to bring your abstraction of your process down in closer to track down where you're leaking value, so you can figure out how to curate the practices that are going to tighten things up.
Okay, so we should probably start out with what this thing agile actually means. I know there's the Agile Manifesto that's been around for a while, and there's all this other stuff like scaled agile frameworks and Scrum. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, well, first I'll promise I won't read you the Agile Manifesto. We're just talking about that is 2001 Agile Manifesto. It's a statement of 12 principles. So you can print this out on a sheet of paper and put it up on your wall, right? So we're not talking about some big gigantic framework, and it's definitely not intended as synonymous with Scrum. Just think of Agile as the set of principles that can help validate the practice choices that you make. So take a step back. Think about when the Agile Manifesto first came out in 2001. This software projects is getting increasingly complex. The failure rate of software projects was very high. And a practice that was really promoted at conferences in the 90s was that you had to prevent stakeholders from changing anything once work went into progress, right? It was waterfall. And that's a context that we came out of, right?
So didn't the Agile movement kind of grow out of this lean management model or this lean movement that came from the automobile industry?
Right. Yeah. Everybody that was the progenitors of Agile were all kind of immersed in lean at that time, right? And lean is a philosophy that places a lot of importance on removing waste. It emerged out of Toyota in the post-World War II period. It was championed in the West by W. Edwards Demings, this guy right here, totally awesome guy. And he worked with Toyota in the post-war period. And he wrote a whole series of books. There's a ton of books by him. And his books in the 1970s were the cornerstone of the just-in-time manufacturing revolution. That's pretty famous. And then he wrote this 1982 book. It's just one of them. But it's called Quality, Productivity, and Competitive Position. And it provides a really solid perspective on the state of lean theory just as software developers were beginning to get immersed in lean. Yeah,
I've heard of Eric Ries's standard work on lean. It's the lean startup. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, there's like a ton of lean. There's lean programs and frameworks. There's lean enterprise. There's Six Sigma, and there's these formalized methodologies. But really, for our purposes as an Agile, we just really want to get back and reflect on these underlying principles, right? Focus on the customer, figure out what's going on in the work, and figure out where the waste is in the work, right? So you don't have to like become an expert in Six Sigma to benefit from studying lean principles. The lean principles are intended to help you better understand the work and reduce work and wasted effort to improve the value of the end product. And you find a lot of that stuff embodied in Scrum.
So whenever I hear about lean manufacturing, you know, the Japanese principles that were made, we hear these terms Muda, Muri, and Mura. What's that?
Well, they're Japanese, right? So lean gives us a taxonomy for describing different kinds of wasteful activities. That's what that is a taxonomy. So we can be more precise about what's eating away at our margins. And so those three are non-value adding activities, overburdening, and inconsistency. So building features that aren't needed, right? That's an example of non-value adding activities. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff. Excessive task switching, having developers diverted to urgent tasks over top of planned work, pushing too much work into play at once. Those are all activities of overburdening. And then for unevenness, that the third one, unevenness, or I think there's another term.
Inconsistency.
Inconsistency. In our world, kind of classic examples are
things that don't make sense.
well, deploying when you deploy servers that are incorrectly configured, when you have devs working on local dev environments that are inconsistent with the production environments, and the kind of problems that those represent is just wasted time that falls into this taxonomy of unevenness, right? And there's a lot of the testing type of problems fall into that category as well.
Actually, that sounds very familiar. You have your dev environment set up, settings vary from the staging environment, and then when you want to push to production, it's like, another set of different settings?
So lean and agile are sets of principles that are dedicated to help you increase the value of your work stream. Lean through the reduction of waste, and agile by building the right thing. So they're really just two sides of the same coin, right? Because you can't, if you build the wrong thing, then you're wasting time, right? But it's helpful to keep the distinction, and we'll see that more as we drill into work scheduling practices.
Yeah, so let's just be clear here. This talk is about best practices, and we're talking about principles and practices, but what is the difference between these two specific terms?
Sure. The way that we're talking about these terms, principles are things you can reflect on, practices are things that you can implement. So, for example, the first principle of the Agile Manifesto is that our highest priority is to satisfy the customer with the early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And that principle is the inspiration of a technical practice that goes by the name of continuous delivery, which we can talk about implementing. And the canonical reference for that is Jez Humble and David Fairley's book, Continuous Delivery, which everybody should buy and read. And the practice is really, it's a lot more than DevOps, continuous delivery. And when you really get into it, it's a really big undertaking for any organization, because you have to have the stakeholders involved in your pipeline before you really get to continuous delivery. And as much as I recommend it, you don't need to build a whole CD pipeline to benefit from reflection on the principle. And so a way to think about it is that the agile principle of continuous delivery is like you're on the beach contemplating the sunrise, reflecting on the principle, thinking about how to make your deliveries less risky, right? The technical practice of continuous delivery is like making a cross-country bicycle trip, right? It's a really tremendously more effort. It can be great value if you get it done, but you don't have to do it in order to get the value out of reflection, putting your problems in the light of the principles themselves.
So we basically shouldn't let the glamour of some intensive best practice blind us to the benefits of simply placing immediate challenges in the light of our core principles for agile and lean.
Thinking from first principles, yeah. Don't just
that's Elon Musk.
grab off some, like, now we need to do test-driven development because somebody says that's a really big thing, right? That's going to be not a big
So
plus.
we can fall into the best practices trap, and which brings us to Act 2, prisoner of Scrum.
Right, which is just a name. Going
Yeah.
out,
So
right?
so Michael, I mean, do we Scrum or don't we? I mean, so when it comes to the actual practice, it seems like things break down to project management, scheduling, release management. Does that make sense?
Yeah, those are the things. They're all interrelated. But when we talk about our technical practices, we're really talking about our work scheduling system. And it's kind of the category that Scrum fits in. Scrum is a work scheduling system. And so however you schedule your work, that's where you're going to put together these practices. And one way to get your process really tangled up is to conflate project management with work scheduling and work scheduling with release management. You want to decompose those things. Project management is where you're going to set the strategy for balancing time, budget, and scope. And work scheduling is where you're going to work out the tactics of how you're going to accomplish those goals. So if you're trying to balance time, budget, and scope within your work scheduling thing, then you're kind of like mixing the two things up. You should have that solved on a higher level. And then release management is where you're going to deliver on your goals, including setting stakeholder expectations. But since our focus here is on best practices, we're going to primarily focus on the work scheduling, which is this container that your technical practices that you adopt live in.
Oh, look at that guy. It's a prisoner of Scrum, yeah. So work scheduling is Scrum, or can we equate
Well,
that?
there's a number of common practices, right? There's waterfall, right, where you plan from inception to delivery before starting. Scrum is where you batch work in time box iterations. Kanban is where your iterations aren't time boxed, but you set limits on the amount of work in progress. And then there's any other ad hoc or bespoke system that you use to schedule your work, right? So, if you're using some bespoke system other than Scrum or Kanban, if it works for you, you don't really have to surrender yourself to Scrum jail just because all your friends are there. You just need to figure out where your problems are first, and then make sure that you're adopting practices that make sense for the problems that you're actually having.
So you mentioned waterfall. I mean, this is like the big bad. We've heard of that we dread it. It's like a work scheduling system. It's what we do not dare to speak about, like Voldemort.
Yeah, right. Usually that's true, but really, when you think about it, waterfall is perfectly appropriate. For example, if you have a very small project in well-known technology and domain space, the client that has a definite objective, and they're heavily committed to a fixed budget. So the problem that waterfall is trying to solve is achieving a predictable outcome by controlling all of the project variables. And when it comes down to it, it's good work if you can get it. It's just that if the project involves some new technology, unfamiliar problem domain, the requirements that are otherwise likely to change during the process, then you're not going to be able to control all the variables. You need to adopt a scheduling system where somehow you keep the resource allocations aligned with the shifting and emerging objectives. So you're like the proverbial changing of the wheel on the moving carriage. And that's more along the lines of what most of us face, right?
Yeah, so we just have so many different variables, but how does that work with Scrum?
So, right, Scrum we're familiar with as it's typically 2-week cycle of iterations with a set of prescribed meetings, definite roles, along with an array of core practices that are recommended. And the problem that Scrum is trying to solve is also predictable outcome by solving the most important problems first and by a dogged persistence at incremental accomplishment, right? That's where this rugby Scrum metaphor comes from. It's a focus on moving the ball down the field and never giving up ground, right? That's the spirit of Scrum.
Dogged persistence, that's we have lots of dogs here.
Yeah, it's a great system when it works.
Okay, but we also know Kanban. Kanban is like the cool cousin of Scrum.
Kanban that's the Toyota factory floor system, or as it came out of, right? And so Kanban, there's no, in software, there's no time box sprints. Instead, you batch work by work in progress limits, and you coordinate it by these buffer and pull policies. It kind of has important implications on how you do release management. There are very few prescribed practices, so it's very lightweight. You have to make up your own schedule, your meeting scheduling and all that stuff is not prescribed. The problem that Kanban's trying to solve is also predictable outcome, right? Everybody's after the same thing by emphasizing the strategic advantage of focus on quality over maximizing capacity. That's the spirit of Kanban. The Kanban metaphor is of traffic control, right? Kanban means signal card in Japanese, Kanban. And it's a system to call attention to what's going wrong in real time so that the team can come together and make things right then and there. So if you're on the automotive factory floor, when a Kanban flag is raised, then within seconds you've got somebody that's over there that is attending to whatever the issue is, right? So that's the spirit of what we want to do in software as well.
So Act 3, the brutal one. An adult is a child that has survived. Okay, Michael, so when we talk about stopping to make things right, I usually think of quality assurance. Is that right?
Yeah, so software QA is really considered to be synonymous with testing. When we say the QA person, we're really talking about the testing person, right? And tests consist of essentially proof of compliance with requirements. And this is really a pretty narrow conception compared to the way the term is used in manufacturing. So practices that prevent the recurrence of defects is more consistent with the conception of QA that we're after here. So, for example, ensuring that all stories that come out of work meet an agreed upon definition of done is actually a quality assurance practice, right? What testers are doing are really quality verification, right? Quality assurance is what you're doing when you curate the practices that define your workflow. So when you select that practice of saying definition of done is one of the practices that's in our basket, and we meet this by meeting, the reason that we chose this practice is because it assures the quality of the work that's coming out on the other side.
So if we stick with the metaphor of the production process, producing physical goods, quality assurance in their meaning is that they get the whole process right to have as few defects as possible.
QA is where you avoid creation of the defects, right? Quality verification is where you find the defects and kick them back.
Yeah, so QA seems like QA is like has to start with observing the actual process, observing the process as its own thing, and trying to understand what's going on with the work, and to identify where inefficiencies occur.
Right. Yes. Some inefficiencies are pretty obvious, right? When you push code and it breaks the build, right, then your reaction is unavoidable. That's not really a problem. But a lot of wasteful activity in your process is subtle and more easily overlooked. And so when you compare it to debugging software, when you've got a difficult problem, you can't really pin it down by just running the application or running the site. Then you need to break out your debugger, set a breakpoint, step through code, observe object state change until you can pin down what the problem actually is. And I want you to think of process bugs really in the same way, that sometimes what's going on in your process, what's really slowing you down, is really only evident when you study the work in the context of its progress through the system. Otherwise, it goes unnoticed. And so to see the work in context, we need to see a model of our system.
Okay, so this slide, can you just tell us where do we take this particular image from? And
right, this comes out, there's, David Anderson wrote a book called Kanban, which I highly recommend to anyone, whether you're using Kanban or not, because it'll clarify a lot of ideas. And then he recently published a book with Theo Bezhova they called the Kanban maturity model, which is also great work. But you should read the Kanban book first, and then if you're still interested, then the Kanban maturity model.
And with this, we're trying to model our process?
So yeah, the visualization of the work is an attempt to build a model of your system, right? To build a model of your process. And we're not trying to model what we think the process should be. Right? We just want to build a model that reflects the process as it actually is, for better or worse. Right? Where improvement is needed, we want to actually fix the problem and then have that fix show up in your model. Because usually when we talk about process, we sit down and we say, okay, what's our process supposed to be? And then, then you have the reality of what work is, and there's this disconnect between the theory of what the process is and the practice of what we're actually doing. And so we want to visualize what we have actually going on. And cards on a wall are a good start, but our model needs structure. Defining a taxonomy, classifying types of work, requires us to sort out what are really the attributes and events that make one type of work different from another to help us understand what we need to observe and control about the different types of work. And so modeling types of work in swim lanes across the card wall can help communicate system tensions, such as overburdening, that could bring them right up on the surface to where you can see them.
Yeah, we heard about overburdening before, yeah. So what other techniques can we use to add structure to our process model?
Right. One of the more fundamental ones is the types of work. The other would be classes of service. And so
Of service. Okay.
classes of service where we naturally apply different priorities to the work. That's just part of the reality of what we work in. We can model that reality as classes of service to reflect how resource allocations are actually playing out. So modeling classes of service as card colors is a way to call out potential conflicts early on. The classes of service that Anderson and Bezova provide in the Kanban, you can use different taxonomies, but this is just a suggestion as a starting point, where you have a class of service which is standard, and that's your basic workflow, what you usually normally expect to do with work as it comes into your system. They suggest providing fixed date as a separate class of service, and fixed date work behaves the same as standard work when it goes into the system, but it has to be done by the date of World Cup, or it has to be done by Christmas, or it has no value at all. And so fixed date work it starts out being the same as standard work, but then it takes on different behaviors of urgency as it approaches its due date. And so it's helpful to model it separately, independently. Expedited work is pretty self-explanatory, any work that takes priority over anything else. And that's it's a typical problem in Scrum, where you have the team dedicated to a sprint goal, and then you've got some kind of something that comes in that was never specified, and it's got to go through that team. And so
An emergency or something.
Yeah, the expedited, by bottling it on the card wall, then you don't have to talk about it with everybody about what's going on. It's just a way to get it up there so it's self-evident what's happening. Intangible is a class of work where there has to be some value associated with the story in order for it to go into work. But sometimes there's stories that don't have any kind of definite date, and refactoring is that kind of work, right? So you put a refactoring story in, and the refactoring story can always be deprioritized to standard work.
And usually is, yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Often it is. And so modeling intangible work as a separate color on your wall gives you a way you can step back and you can try to make sure that kind of overall in general, sooner or later, you get around to this intangible work, because it's work that you put it into work because there's a value, and if you don't ever get it done, then eventually there'll be a cost to not having gotten the work done. So classes of work, classes of service and types of work are two ways of classifying things, and there's probably other taxonomies that you can develop. There are many other taxonomies that you can develop to give structure to the model of what you're actually doing.
So let me just get that right. So what you're saying is that through visualizing our process, like on a board or on a wall, we need to, when we actually talk to each other, we need to point out things far less, because a visualization puts it all at a glance.
Right. If you can make self-evident what's happening on your team, so you don't have to talk about it, then you can take your communication time up to the next higher level. So when you're talking about things, you're not just sorting out what's happening, you're talking about what needs to be done. One thing that's not really evident from the card wall is how we model how much time is focused on task. And when I say time focused on task, we're talking about
on working on the task.
Working on the task, right? So when we say available work, we've already discounted vacation days and doctor's appointments and time blocked for other activities, and we're already down to the time available for work. And out of that, your team's capacity is the time available for work minus the time you spend coordinating the activities and minus the time you spend staging the work. And so coordination and staging activities, they're essential, they're necessary. If you shortchange those things, you're going to pay the price in some way, but obviously you want to keep these things as a minimum. Now in Scrum, you would, if the Scrum meetings are 20% of your available time. And so in Scrum, your coordination time is going to be larger than 20% because you have 20% time already dedicated to coordination plus whatever increment that you spend coordinating work while the work is in progress. And then the transactional work is the time you setting up local environments, staging work to servers, all that kind of stuff, right? So how much of the time can you actually get focused on work on task?
And it usually ends up to be more. So if we notice an increase of the time spent in meetings or in the transactional activities, this is an indication of an issue, of some kind of inefficiency in the process.
Right. When we begin to feel like the discussion in meetings is less productive, time is lost on staging some server staging failure, then we want to try to work backwards to the root cause. We can try to classify our problem into our taxonomy of waste, right? Are we wasting time because there's like some unnecessary work? Is it some unevenness? Is it overburdening? And then from there, we can try to work backwards to identify what practice change is needed to minimize or prevent the recurrence of that same issue. So keeping a focus on the available time of work on task is really a key performance indicator of your process health. And it's this is the needle that you're trying to move as you curate the practices that you adopt. Those are your best practices, are the ones that end up with more, at least in one metric, end up with more work on task, more time working on task.
Yeah, when I see that guy, I want to help him just pull that log. He looks really overburdened. So increasing the time on the actual task, working on the task, improves our overall capacity. So the other day we were at this beer place here in Darmstadt together with an agency lead. And he said that they're a $12 million agency. So isn't that their capacity? They can deliver around $1 million a month in work. Isn't that their capacity?
Well, more often than not, when people say that, they're talking about how much work they can start, right? They can say, we can start $12 million worth of work. And because agency leads tend to think in terms of sales. But your capacity is not the amount of work you can put into motion. It's the amount of work you can finish, right? Putting more work into motion than you have capacity for is one of the most common problems that we have in building software. And sometimes it's driven by the fear of falling short on needed income. Sometimes it's just obsessive compulsive behavior, so it's a psychiatric problem. Sometimes it's because you just don't have a clear idea of what your capacity is. So that's the one that we can actually deal with.
But if we picture our capacity, our team's capacity as like a pipe, if we keep pushing work in and it doesn't come out at the same rate, then we're going to spring a leak.
Somewhere,
yeah.
Right? So the pipeline's a great metaphor for thinking about your process, right? And regulating the flow into the pipeline is effectively the domain of project management, right? Because once it's in the pipeline, then you can try to mitigate the damage in your work scheduling practices, but there's going to be a cost as you spend more time coordinating activities and staging activities, and that's all going to count against the time available on task. And so one way you can think of capacity is the amount of work and progress you can handle where the coordination and staging time are under some target. So if you have a target of saying, our target is like 20% coordination, 15% staging, then if your time on those areas starts to like spread out from there, then you know that you're exceeding capacity.
So we talk about capacity all the time, but is there some way to calculate capacity?
Right. There's a simple formula called Little's Law that calculates flow efficiency in software development. You need to know lead time in order for this math to work. And Kanban is the only system I know that gives you lead time out of the box, right? In Scrum, you can use a velocity calculation, which we talked about in more detail in our session yesterday on estimation. But you really need to, one way or the other, you need to get a grip on capacity before you're going to have much success in release management, and definitely before you can get successful at setting expectations. So if your project backlog is reasonably decomposed in small stories that are independent, verifiable, small, and you actually understand your capacity, then a product owner can reasonably set expectation on delivery of backlog items without having to ask for effort estimations, right? If you get that, if you actually understand what the capacity is. So queue times are definitely measured in little laws, and queue times is one of the really, that is like the big problem with setting expectations.
So when work sits in
When work
a
sits
queue,
between, yeah, because you have all the work on effort, right? We estimate the effort that's going to go in to do the work, but the time that it's waiting for testing, it's waiting for review, it's waiting for staging, it's waiting for UAT, it's waiting for delivery, it's waiting for somebody to clarify requirements, right? That's all queue time, and you can't avoid queue time, but you also can't understand capacity without figuring out what your queue time is, right? And Kanban, it fits in because you constrain the amount of work in progress, so you're forced to, your queue time is just right there on the surface because you can only have so much work in progress at one time. In Kanban, you push everything, in Scrum, you push everything into a sprint box, and then the queue time is like, it's somewhere in that box. The stuff goes in, the stuff comes out.
Okay, so you mentioned release management. We have project management where we regulate the pressure. We have work scheduling, which is what we do in Scrum, and we work on increasing our capacity. And we have release management where it all comes together to be sent out there to our users, and where we also set expectations and where we meet them. But it is also where we can actually jam up the pipeline in release management.
Yeah, because the release is the only thing that the stakeholder ultimately cares about. They don't care about the rest of the stuff, right?
They want to see stuff on their screen, yeah.
Right, and so there's costs that are associated with the release management that are really commonly underestimated, and a lot of it has to do with effective queue time on scheduling. And so every conversation you have about what's going into the release, what's not going in, what's not going to make it, what's blocking, what's waiting, these are all coordination costs of release management, and it's up to you to try to recognize what part of that conversation is normal and reasonable, and what part is waste that's resulting from misunderstandings and miscalculations, and try to figure out how to avoid that stuff in the future. And then when you start considering activities for staging releases, the transactional costs, including all the time going into setting up servers for testing and UAT and delivery, like even very small errors can add up to a lot of time. And so investing in a fully automated pipeline, DevOps, is a really, really safe bet. And when you stack it up against your failure to meet expectations due to you reduce capacity due to time lost because you had to restage incorrectly configured environments, right, your DevOps expenses are very cheap overall.
Yeah, so we've reached now the end of our presentation, but let me just understand, we've pretty much covered a lot of the areas of process optimization, and how do we summarize this session?
Well, you can't do everything at once, and every practice you adopt takes time. So even when a given practice is a good thing in general, if it doesn't remediate the specific problems that you're facing right now, then the net result can be negative, right? Because you're investing time that doesn't fix your immediate problems. You have to do the most important things first in order for them really to become your best practices. When you consider adding a practice to your process, then you should think about how you're going to measure success, right? Not just like adding it in because it sounds like a good idea. How is it helping or hurting your capacity? Because certain practices can hurt your capacity rather than help. And so it may seem obvious, but working software delivered to production is basically the gold standard metric. And in fact, it aligns with the Agile principle. We value early and continuous delivery of valuable software over pretty much everything else. And so, like in Kanban, you have Little's Law that can really help, measure that flow of what's going in. But however you do it, this is a key factor to move forward when sorting out what your best practice is. Meeting stakeholder expectations, right? That's what we're all trying to do. An important aspect of setting and meeting stakeholder expectations is understanding capacity. And you can't get a grip on capacity until you flush out the actual queue dynamics in your system. So to actually understand capacity from a technical perspective, building your card wall into a coherent model of your process is pretty much table stakes. And so that it can put you in a position where you can begin to debug your process and get a better grip on where work is being held up, and then to adapt your process to reduce those same problems going forward. And so if you're using, how many people are using Jira going in? Right, so Jira, it's a great system or a bad system, whatever, but it seems very limiting to me, and I would suggest that you might experiment with, like, you probably still have to continue using it, but using something like Real-Time Board or one of these many other tools that are available to build out your model in a way that you can do it completely freely, right, without the limitations of Jira. And you'll have the extra time of maintaining 2 boards, but you'll actually be able to build a process model that is going to reflect what it is that's really going on, so you can begin to understand where your problems are. So the other metric we discussed is the distribution of time available for work between coordination activities, staging activities, and time on task. And so we're not suggesting that you need to like track these variables as absolute values somehow, right? If you could, that'd be great, but I don't really see a clean way to do that. But you want to keep an eye on when coordination and staging activities are generating more friction than you're comfortable with. And then you can try working backwards to try to sort the issues according to your taxonomy of waste and adapt the process so that adapt the process model, the card wall, to begin to surface observations about the class of issue that is causing the problem. So if you're having issues, a lot of issues with like blocking tasks, then you can like create a taxonomy of different ways work is being blocked, and then begin to like decorate your cards on the card wall according to that taxonomy, so you can try to begin to figure out where your problems actually are, so you can adapt your practice to not have those problems anymore, so you get your time back, right? So the result that we're looking for is an increase in time on task, right? More time on task, more software delivered to production, meeting stakeholder expectations, right? These are the outcomes that determine which practices are best practices in your practice, right? So that's pretty much where we are.
Yeah, thanks. We hope that we have a bit of time for a
We have a few minutes for questions,
Yeah.
right, going out, so.
Thanks. You just said that Jira is limiting.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a little bit? We just switched to
Okay,
using...
first I'll say that I'm not I'm not very well trained in Jira, and so it may be unfair. Maybe I'm just ignorant at the limitations of Jira. I just began to like get into the interface. I find it difficult and complicated. You can set up swim lanes. You can model classes of work. I don't really see how to do types of service and decorators on cards, and so I end up looking at Jira as being sort of like a visual database, but it's like, you know, when you're trying to like debug the process that you're in, it's actually very complex, the array of problems that you're actually dealing with. And I think you want more flexibility than I can find. See, the other problem is, even if you could find the way to model the different problems that you're having in Jira, that the amount of work it takes to set all that stuff up, right? It's really, you kind of end up needing to be like a full-time Jira person in order to just to make the stuff work. And then it's really a changing problem. You don't want to solve one problem. You want to solve like 30 different problems across the course of the year by consistently figuring out what you need to observe, decomposing it into different attributes or events, modeling those attributes and events, observing those over the course of time in your system, and thinking about those observations to try to figure out what practices, essentially QA practices, would prevent the recurrence of whatever is chewing up the time, right? So for now, all I can think of is you need to maintain 2 boards if you have to use Jira.
Any further questions? Anyone else? It's heavy. I wanna No questions? Michael, I think you just answered everything. You've solved all the problems.
Thank you so much to come out, for coming out. Our Twitter handles are both on there, August 1914. And you're welcome to receive any questions, comments, and further discussion, right? This is, for me, this is all an unfolding thing I'll be working on ongoingly. So I'd really be more than happy to have extended conversations about exactly what your problems are.
We have a question. Whoops. Sorry, can you just hand this over?
So you mentioned tools like real-time board, and that's what we use to facilitate remote retrospectives. What's your experience around facilitating remote retrospectives?
Real-time board would be an excellent medium for that. Remote retrospectives are challenging in many ways, right? Retrospectives per se are challenging, right? Retrospectives are incredibly important and really hard to do, right? Because you have the tensions that you need to talk about in the team. There's reasons why people don't want to talk about them because they're tensions. And so you go to the retrospective, and if the real tensions don't get talked about, then you lost that opportunity right in there. And so how do you elicit real tensions? One technique in retrospectives is to start out the retrospective with anonymous safety level settings, right? And so that's where you ask everyone in the team to report a safety level between 1 and 5, or 1 and 10, or whatever you choose. And a high number means they feel very free about talking in the team, and a 1 means they don't feel very safe about saying things. And then you can use that to try to elicit a response of, because I've been on teams where I've ponied up a 1, right? I said, you know, I'm here, but I really don't think you want to hear what I have to say, and so I'm not even going to say it, right? That's a 1. So safety levels is a tool to try to bring that out. Timelines is a technique to try to get people talking, right? To say everybody does a card of 3 events that are memorable over this last time frame, right? And then you take all those cards and you kind of build them out into a timeline of events, and that gives the way for one team member to see what the other team member's perspective was, what was important to them. If everybody puts up the same events, right, then if everybody puts up different events, then that's a significant thing. There's a podcast called the Scrum Master's Toolbox with Velasco Duarte, and he has a book or an ebook called Scrum Retrospectives, right? And that's probably the best resource I know of like having this whole array of different ways that you can go about trying to get this conversation to happen. Because if you're not doing the retrospective, then you're losing a lot of opportunity. It's interesting in Kanban, in a way, you still do retrospectives. You don't have to. It's not prescribed. Most software teams, I think, it would be recommended to do a retrospective every 2 weeks in Kanban. But every time you put up a signal card is every time you get a break, right? That is actually like a micro retrospective, right? Because you're calling up, you're saying, we have an issue, right? We're going to stop on this thing. You have work in progress limits. We can't bring more work in progress until we solve this issue. And so each event that you come together and talk about becomes like a micro retrospective, and you do it in real time when you're actually having the problem. And so that's one of my votes for Kanban as a system.
One last question, anyone? Because we're out of time. Oh, one more? Okay. Do you mind just passing it?
What if you feel that for your team, well, you're doing maintenance on the same product, just adding little things every now and then? Kanban might be better, but you're in a safe framework and everybody does scrums and you're expected to scrum along.
Right, yeah, the Scrum Gel, right, where you're doing it because it's done, right?
Yeah.
And so, so when you time box the work, then one of the problems that you have is that if in Scrum, if the work's not 100% done, it's 0% done for the sprint, and then it goes over to the next sprint. And that's like almost impossible to do in a maintenance scenario, because the pressure to deliver the thing, it just doesn't matter whether it's 100% done, because if the sprint ends, you're just going to like keep working on it. And if that's what you do, then you kind of like you're defeating the purpose of Scrum, and Scrum is just creating friction at that endpoint. Scrum works well when you have a team that's dedicated to a project that has a longer scope, where you're working out requirements as you go over time, and you're like, it's Scrum metaphor, right? You incremental improvement, move the ball down the field, never give up ground, right? That works good. Product maintenance, it's kind of a crummy way of doing it, right? It's like, so Kanban is a way of, he releases you from it, and then also because you set these work in progress limits, then one of the things in product maintenance, when you have a problem that defies resolution, right? Most of your problems come in, they go out, they get done, and then one comes along that it's like, you just can't fix this thing. And so it's in a lot of cases, it'll just be on somebody's desk. And then you have to like stand up and say, I need help. I don't want to say I need help, because that means I'm not competent. It's, right? You have different difficulties that are associated with it. And Kanban, because you have the work in progress limit, everybody knows that you can't pull another thing into work until that one is done. And then, and it goes into this, there's another concept in both in Scrum and Kanban, which is whether you're modeling the work or the worker, right? It's a really big part of how you're modeling your wall. And so it's, especially in remote teams, it's really easy to model the worker, but there's a lot of diseases that come out of that when you assign, you're modeling the worker. You're saying this worker, and in easier in a co-located team, but when you ideally, and in Scrum or in Kanban, you're working as a team, and so the work gets distributed out to workers, but because you have the work in progress limits, when a story gets stuck and you can't pull more work in, then it's kind of inevitable that the team has to swarm on the block task to say, what are we going to do to resolve this thing right here and now, because it's going to become an issue because we can't pull more work into, and there's something else that we need to do, right? So, yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time now. Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming.